You see, evil forces throughout history have often thought if they can just kill the powerful leader of a Christian movement, they'll put a stop to the Christian movement. But what happens instead, whenever the powerful leader, whenever the upfront face, whenever the person who's the most outspoken in Christian circles, whenever he is cut down, rather, instead of the movement dying out, people rise up in their place. And instead of the movement dying, the movement begins to multiply. Alan Hirsch has pointed out that the church is designed to be less like a spider and more like a starfish. Less like a spider and more like a starfish. And the reason that he makes that analogy is that if you cut a spider in half, both halves are dead. But if you cut a starfish in half, both halves will live. You'll have two starfish. If you cut a spider in half, it's dead. But if you cut a starfish in half, you now have two starfish. And the reason that sea stars or starfish reproduce when they're cut in half is because each half has everything that's needed to regenerate and reproduce. In the 1940s, oyster fishermen were tired of so many of their oysters being lost to sea stars or starfish who eat oysters. So whenever they caught them in their nets, they would take a knife and they would cut them in half. They would cut them up and throw them back with all the rest of the stuff that came up in their nets that they didn't want. What they didn't realize was they weren't killing the starfish, they were multiplying the starfish. And over the period of about 10 years, they doubled the amount of starfish in the sea in that area, and it completely depleted the oyster population that they were fishing from. God has set the church up to be incredibly resilient because each part of the church should have everything necessary for regeneration and reproduction within it. Hear me. What should have happened when Faith Church went into lockdown, what should have happened in March of 2020, when we went to not gathering in one location, but gathering in homes and having services online, what should have happened in that moment is we should have started having 50 gatherings of Faith Church. It should have been something that cut us off from one another, but each segment had the basic components with the necessary pieces within itself for regeneration and multiplication. It should have been like 50 pieces of starfish being thrown out in the sea, which now become 50 new starfish, which will reproduce another generation. A couple of years ago, I told you about a church in Oklahoma, Hirsch Church. And I told you the story about the pastor's wife there. She passed away from cancer. And at her funeral, they asked women that she had discipled to stand. And so the women that she had personally discipled stood. And they asked them to remain standing. And they said, now, if you have been discipled by one of the women that are currently standing, would you stand? And they asked them to stay standing. And they said, if you have been discipled by any of the women now standing, would you stand? And on the third generation of discipleship, there were over 100 women that had been influenced, been discipled by her, or discipled by someone that she discipled, or discipled by someone that was discipled by someone that she discipled. And there were over 100 women, and it was the fulfillment of Jesus' parable that some bring forth 100-fold. Now, I told you that story years ago to demonstrate what my hope, my passion, my desire for Faith Church to be, for us to be this disciple-making movement. And I want you to see that not only gave them the opportunity to reproduce, it also made them incredibly resilient. Because Hirsch Church went into quarantine just like we did in the spring of 2020. But then I saw and was surprised to see that they were going into quarantine again in the fall of 2020. And it wasn't because there had been an outbreak of COVID-19 in their church, but rather they were going back to meeting in homes in the fall, not because of COVID concerns, not because of government mandates, but rather because they had seen so much growth and so many gospel conversations take place in the spring. When their church was separated, it was separated like pieces of starfish, and it was a strategic move to do it again in the fall. What should have happened for Faith Church is we should have been like starfish severed from one another that regenerated and reproduced.